This is Michael Reid Trice with the Religica Theolab and in collaboration with the Center for Religious Wisdom and World Affairs at Seattle University. Today I'm in conversation with Reverend Bryon Hansen, and we're discussing ritual in a pandemic time and preparing for transformation, for naming what needs to be restored. Take a listen.
My name is Bryon Hansen, and I'm pastor at Phinney Ridge Lutheran Church in Northwest Seattle. We are a neighborhood church dedicated to authentic worship and faith formation and a commitment to justice in the world. We are a member congregation of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. I see my role there as being spiritual director, sort of the shepherd of the flock. That involves a lot of things, a lot of tasks. But I think for me, the overriding image that helps me on a day-to-day basis is to see that I am a spiritual director. That is, I feel my call is to always try best I can to point to the gospel and to announce God's love and presence in our lives and activity in our lives, and to bring the staff and the people and the leadership sort of back to that place.
People are living right now through a time where we have to really lean in as leaders with these communities. It's difficult. It's a stressful time. To say that would be an understatement. And we know a lot of people in local communities can also feel marooned right now for one reason or another. And for many religions, Christianity included, we're also on the cusp of a time or in a season in which we wonder aloud about where God is. Where is the transcendent today amidst all of these challenges? What do you say? How do you respond when people ask you, where's God?
What I may say to one person who's going through a particularly tough time may be different than the next person who is going through a tough time in a different way. So I don't know. It's a really hard thing to answer. None of us really knows, I guess. But this is what I feel I know as a Christian. It seems to me that God shows up in love. When that happens, for me, the wisdom of God seems to shimmer. I find that there's a lot of brokenness and sadness and death in this time. And God shows up in those broken places. What I mean by that is there are people crying out in pain, and the response of many humans, including Christians, is one of love. For me, what I know of God has been revealed in Jesus, who's all about love. And when I see the response of love or the sharing of love, then I find glimpses of God. The other thing is that a time like this can expose our adherence to other gods, I guess, or idolatry. You know, we are consumers in this land. Our consumerism, I wonder, has been maybe challenged or maybe actually for many people for the first time been given over to some scrutiny. Maybe this isn't what it's cracked up to be. Maybe this isn't real life. So I wonder if this is, if a time like this is bringing people back to primary questions of meaning. I think there are times like this where people can ask, what is life? You know, what does it mean to be a human? What does it mean to be living on this planet? Who is God?
We know from colleagues and friends in other religions that although love and the expressions of love are shaped, let's say, in the doctrines of a particular religion uniquely, at the same time, as I hear you speak, this centrifuge of love, if you call it, where community shows up around love in what we might call ritual, has a way of, it's almost like a world that brings a gravity to itself, right? Like, shouldn't I be able to, for instance, look across a ritual, and I'm hoping you'll tell us what rituals are, but shouldn't I be able to look across a ritual and see another human being today or tomorrow or even 1,000 years before, if you get my drift, that we belong to a certain community where that sense of love even escapes each one of us where we are in time. It tells us something about what it means to be, to search for meaning under the arc of the transcendent. What is a ritual?
Well, first of all, there's all kinds of rituals. I mean, if ritual is about, celebrations and reenactments or elaborations, practices of any kind. I mean, everyone has a ritual, right? That's a really hard question to answer. But I do believe that if you talk to people, whether they name rituals or not as ritual, they will certainly speak from those places. And I think that what I've noticed is that rituals do something. Maybe the better question is, what do they do? What does a ritual do? Not what it means. You and I live in the land of Seahawks pride. I think it's great to have that much pride in a football team. It's really excessive, but but if you've ever participated in a watch party for a Seahawks game, you can just kind of stand back and observe the ritual. It does something. People get really caught up in the game, and you may find people yelling at the TV or cheering or being so moved because of the success of the Seahawks in a game that they'll hug everybody, or being so moved the other direction that they may be prone to break the furniture in the living room, So rituals do something. And I do believe sacred rituals do something. So when it comes to ritual, for example, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, I think the question is more around what does it do? I think questions of meaning often come later. For example, in the early church, I think sort of the whole tradition of doctrine came about as a reflection upon what Christians were already doing. For example, the earliest Christians just did Eucharist, and then centuries later, you had countless reflections on what does this mean.
You mentioned sacred ritual. That's an example. What makes sacred ritual so unique from, say, watching a football game?
Well, because I believe God is directly involved in it. It doesn't mean that God's not in the football game. I'm sure God is somehow, but there is a direct naming of God and naming of the people involved in the ritual as followers of Jesus or children of God or whoever. And so it's a venue through which God acts, through which God speaks, through which God touches us and transforms us.
It seems to me people are hungry for transformation, transform relationships, transform lives. We're entering a season where typically people want to take up a sport or lose a lot of weight or do something. But sacred ritual, does that transformation begin inside of each of us? Is that what ritual does? Does it help us to take a good look at who we are in community and maybe asks us to do something, to be something different?
I think so. I think that works communally. I think it can work individually. I guess there's always the reality that we can do with it what we want. We can turn it off. We can reject it. I believe some of the best catechesis or instruction is not around telling people what it means, but eliciting from people their own experience, to reflect on their own experience of the ritual. And from that, there's a lot of rich fare, I believe, because the primary meaning is in the doing of it. For example, I like, as a practitioner of the Christian catechumenate, which is process of preparing adults for baptism, or if they're already baptized, renewal of baptism. I like to do a lot of debriefing or unpacking of ritual. In the process at Phinney, there are several rites or rituals. What we do following, not before, but following the rituals, ask people to debrief with some very pointed questions. What did you see? What did you feel? What did you experience? And to let people know there's no right answer, but what's right is their answer. It's sort of an action reflection model. Some of the rituals can be very unnerving or very moving. You've witnessed or even participated in the rite of welcome, which is at the outset of the catechumenate process when we welcome newcomers into the into the process. And there's a signing of the cross on the body. So the sponsor for a given candidate traces the sign of the cross on the various parts of the person's body. The presider says, receive the cross on your forehead that you may know Jesus Christ. Receive the cross in your ears that you may hear the good news. Receive the cross in your lips that you may sing the praises of Christ. Receive the cross on your heart that God may dwell there in faith. Receive the cross in your hands that God may be known in your work. Receive the cross on your feet that you may walk in the ways of Christ. When people reflect upon it later in the unpacking of it, all kinds of rich responses come forth. It's like, it felt weird for me to be touched, or it was so powerful to be touched, or I felt the mark of God on my body for the first time. What does that mean for my life? And so this becomes a venue through which people can reflect, so then the cross is not subject to some abstract theology or theory of atonement. It's been actually etched on my hands so that Jesus shows up in my work. It's been etched on my shoulders so that I will bear the yoke of Jesus in what I do and say.
Do you feel like when you work with people that a generation before may have spent a little more time asking themselves what the instruction of the church or of religion generally should be, but that now we're at a time, as you mentioned earlier, it's not so much about the instruction external. People want to be reassured perhaps that what they're feeling, thinking spiritually, the direction they're on, that internal barometer, of how they're living their lives. They want spiritual directors to be in touch with that. So it's the other way around, that somehow the formation is affirmed on the road I'm on. The questions I'm asking are meaningful, even if I don't have all the answers. Is that true? Do you see that kind of shift in the last few years?
Yeah, I do. I think that's why people are coming to church these days, because they really want to. They're looking for something like that. It's already past the heyday of people coming out of duty or obligation or just the tradition of being brought up in a particular denomination or whatever. I think that more and more folks are really looking for meaning. What's interesting to me is that the churches, at least the mainline churches, in my opinion, their typical response to that is, well, we have to reimagine the church, or we have to do things differently. Certainly there's an element of truth to that, but I think that in other ways, I wonder. I mean, maybe part of it is just reclaiming who we really are.
How are you helping your community prepare for the renewal that they need to bear in mind and in heart during this particular winter?
That's a really great question. And actually, Pastor Ann and I and the staff are just starting to talk about that with regard to Advent. But I think you have to go back to ritual. You cannot give people explanations. That doesn't fulfill. But I think you have to go back to ritual. I think Advent is an invitation, for example, to pray and in some ways to lament. And lament is something I believe is very rich in the Jewish Christian tradition, but we've sort of walked away from it. It's time to kind of recover it. And now I'm not speaking just about individual lament, but communal lament.
I had a very good friend pass away in May. There was no public ritual, no real chance to mourn together, to meet together. And now, as I get older, I realize, and then the months later, I realize how much I miss that. Grieving in private is not sustainable, I think. We grieve with each other, and lament has a kind of public showing too, doesn't it?
I had the same experience personally with my mom's death in September. She was pretty active in her church community, but we could not have a service at the church because of the pandemic. There would have been 100 people easily. We would have had singing and preaching and praying and Holy Communion, but none of that was possible. So we had a graveside service that felt truncated for me. And given the COVID restrictions, no more than 30 people could be there. you work with what you can, which is fine, but it just didn't seem like we were given enough time and space to grieve. I think that's part of what the rituals around death and dying do. Given our culture of denial of death, we don't like to even face that, though. Even with our so-called funeral rituals, have you noticed people talk about a celebration of life? That seems to be the latest thing now.
Or a transition ceremony.
Yeah. There's nothing wrong with celebrating the life of a deceased person. I think that's great, but that's only part of the story. There's also time to lament this death, this loss, to sort of exorcise that out of the ritual is, we do that at our peril, I think. I think without corporate or communal grieving, anger just intensifies, and I think we become more violent toward one another and ourselves. I don't think society knows how to grieve. And I'm not sure the church does it well either necessarily, but I think we do have the resources to maybe provide that witness and provide that reality, that experience for people.
So is it possible that rituals give us not permission, but they help focus the need to lament? They clear the ground in our lives and in our communal lives as well that reassures us that that lament or that grief on the ruins of experience or whatever should take up residence. It's worth our time because it teaches us something. And this goes back to your point about teaching. It instructs us. To your words, instruction that doesn't transform us is just another quiz. But if instruction around ritual, like at the graveside, can transform us or provide room for lament, there's something even bittersweet about that. It's so necessary.
Yes. Yeah. It changes us.
Right.
And God can be at work in that, changing us.
I want to ask one last question about ritual and what it does to us, because psychologists and even general practitioners are starting to have, in this time of real stressors in society, starting to have conversations with their patients around what they're experiencing in terms of regret. So there's a lot of people thinking right now about regret in their lives has a kind of corrosive tendency. It has a way of making us second guess it. It can feel like the burden that won't be lifted. In a time like that where we're seeking transformation, what does ritual say to individual regret?
I think if you bring regret to God instead of hiding it or bring it out in the open, I think just the acknowledgement of that is so important. I've told people in the past, don't dwell on regret, but I'm doing that now with my mom's death. Oh, I wish I would have done this, or I wish I would. We just can't help it. Rather than speculating or rather than theologizing about it, it is again to get into the primary theology of doing it. For some people, that may be a confession of sin. But for a lot of people, I think it's merely just a confession of pain. As you know, the Augustinian tradition, which is so wonderful and rich, has some issues. And sometimes we get so caught up in, guilt and sin that we forget people's pain. Rituals around healing, for example, healing rituals must include permission given to lament, to grieve, to name regret, to name all those things. And I think that can happen too in small groups and in what Luther would call the mutual consolation and conversation of brothers and sisters. Unfortunately, we've only put it there and have forgot to put it in the public ritual space. And I think it's time to do that, because I think unprocessed grief really leads to destructive behavior, individually and corporately.
You've been listening to the Religica Theolab podcast in the Center for Religious Wisdom and World Affairs at Seattle University. To learn more about the center's work and for resources to be used in local communities, visit us at seattleu.edu/thecenter.